Good morning, people of grace. Welcome to our digital worship segment on this Lord's Day. I hope that you are doing well enough during this COVID-19 pandemic. Please let me know, call the church office, call my cell phone, email me if you have any needs. The church does want to be responsive to that, and we have things in place to try to help out. So please just let me know so we can help you. Today's segment has several parts to it. There is a passage for reflection and meditation, Psalm 119, verses 65 through 72, probably written after Israel had suffered exile. And through that affliction, the psalmist is writing some things he learned in this segment of Psalm 119. So that's a passage for your reflection and meditation. Mark and Sherry have put together a music component for you, and I would encourage you to thoroughly enjoy that. Maybe you already have before even seeing this sermon. Our scripture passage is from Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 through 14, and it's going to be an expansion of the theme of submission that was from Ephesians chapter 5 last week. So hopefully this will be a blessing to you, and it will close with just a couple questions for you to walk away with and hopefully spend some time on further reflection and contemplation. So we are now in this several weeks into this kind of social distancing and almost kind of shelter in place mode, not quite shelter in place, but close to that. And though people seem to be trying to adjust and really rising to the occasion, there's still a tremendous level of fear. And as this shutdown continues and people see their supplies dwindling or just going stir crazy, you may start to see more of that fear and the kind of negative energy it drives coming out. And I want us to be prepared for that and make sure that we don't allow ourselves to slip into that as followers of Jesus. So I want to talk about an expansion, as I said, of this idea of submission out of reverence for Christ. One of the ways that we keep our spirit filled from Ephesians 5 is to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But what does that mean? The more kind of literal translation would be submit to one another out of fear of Christ. And I want to talk about fear, maturity, and God's design for us. So I have 4 questions, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Number 1, what is fear? Number 2, what is reverence? They're related. Number 3, what did fear teach Jesus? Our passage from Hebrews says that Jesus learned things because he feared. And that's worth exploring. What did fear teach Jesus? And our 4th question is, then what can fear teach us? What is fear? What is reverence? What did fear teach Jesus? And what can fear teach us? Those are the 4 questions. In the English language, we will say something like this at a time like COVID-19. When it rains, it pours. You actually find sayings like that in a lot of languages. I know in Japan, they say, when crying, stung by bee. When crying, stung by bee. And that sense of, wow, why is it when things are hard, more hard things happen? Why is it when things are painful, we get hit with more painful things? And that angst in the human spirit across many cultures, when it rains, it pours, when crying, stung by bee, that is almost a universal human question. I think it is a universal human question about what C.S. Lewis called the problem of pain. And it needs to get our attention. And we need to kind of dial in and learn from it, because pain and the fear that pain naturally brings, the avoidance that pain naturally brings, really gets to the heart of our condition. And what we do with that says a lot about how we will live our lives, whether we will live them in a way that is empowering or in a way that is making us more and more powerless and more enslaved in our souls. So though I want to just kind of lay that as a foundation and talk about what is fear. And to boil it down, fear is our response to a potential pain or to actual pain, but it's a response to pain, whether emotional or physical, whether we're accurately perceiving the situation, and so in that sense, our fear might be kind of justified, or whether we're just imagining it. There's something that goes on in us deep in our gut, what you can call a fear spike, that happens, and that at its core, at its most basic level, is fear. And as you explore what is fear, then you have to say, well, what am I most afraid of? What am I afraid to lose? That kind of helps us start to unpack that fear. And when we get that fear spike, then our mind starts whirling about everything I have to do to make sure I don't lose whatever I'm afraid to lose. It could be my life, it could be my loved ones, it could be my financial standing, it could be my calling. If Grace Bible Church folded, if this went on long enough, then that could be very fearful for me. And we have to learn to kind of like let ourselves feel that, try to get ahead of that whirling mind, which is not typically really helping the scenario, and go in a different direction with it, which brings it to this idea of reverence. Everybody, including Jesus, as things came into his world, experienced fear in the sense of that physiological, emotional fear spike. But Jesus learned to do something different with it than we typically do. And that is that Hebrew concept of reverence related to fear. Ephesians chapter 5 last week said, keep filling your spirit through four means, but for today, especially through reverence of Christ or fear of Christ. And to really understand that fear of Christ and say, well, what is reverence? How does that kind of gut level experience turn into something powerful and beneficial in what we would call reverent? In other words, what did that experience of fear, of suffering, of pain, and the desire to avoid pain, which are all normal and human, but what did that teach Jesus? And that brings us to our scripture reading in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. It says that Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered, that he called out to God in the face of his suffering with loud cries and tears, and was heard because of his reverence. But again, that idea of reverence is an aspect of fear. And Jesus experienced the same physiological, emotional fear that we experience, but he did something differently with it. And this is where the scriptures kind of paint that initial fear. It's actually our word phobos, where we get phobias. It kind of paints that as this experience that people have, but you can go one or two directions with it. You can go into timidity and avoidance, or you can go into reverence. So everybody has this experience, but does this experience take you into timidity and avoidance? And that's really what John's getting into, because perfect love would cast that out. You might have that initial spike, but it won't take you into that kind of torment. Or is this going to take you into reverence? And in 2 Timothy 1:7, when Paul says, Timothy, God has not given us a spirit of fear, Paul's not really talking about that fear spike that we all have. He really is saying, Timothy, you can't let that take you into this timidity. You can't let it make you avoidant. You can't let it control your behavior and cause you to withdraw. Now, just as a point of clarification, we're not talking about prudent measures to help slow the spread of the COVID-19. We're talking about what it does to us emotionally. We can make prudent decisions to try to detect and avoid danger. That's a big point from Blauer Tactical Systems. Whenever you sense danger or pain, you detect and avoid. You diffuse. You try to dissipate. That's flattening the curve in this situation. And then if you have to, you defend yourself. Um, that is fear management kind of 101. And we can detect and avoid, but we're even going to do that in a more benevolent way, in a way that really teaches us how to live more for Jesus, if we're not doing it out of the spirit of timidity, but rather prudence. And we often call our timidity prudence because we don't want to admit that we're just being timid. But that's a question that each of us has to really kind of lean into. Am I doing that? Am I really just afraid, but I'm masking it as prudence? Because that's not healthy. That's not dealing honestly with our own emotions. We can be prudent and not be afraid. God is prudent. God does not have a spirit of timidity. So we don't want to go there with it. We want to take this phobos, this energy, and bring it into reverence. And that's what Hebrews 5 is saying about Jesus, is that he faced incredible pain and death and suffering, but instead of becoming timid and avoidant, though he felt that desire, he felt like getting out of Gethsemane and going back to heaven, he leaned into it and he learned to obey God more. That's what fear taught Jesus. It taught him reverence. Nothing quite exposes the choice between timidity and reverence like this fear spike that we all have. Nothing exposes the raw choice between our false self that's just into preserving the self at all cost and therefore will avoid pain, and the true self that's made to revere God and finds itself in doing that no matter what it seems to cost the self. Nothing exposes that choice like this fear spike. If we truly want to mature, we have to choose this day who we will serve as we experience this fear spike. Will we sink into timidity and avoidance, or will we become more reverent and more God-centered and really kind of find ourselves in it? Choose this day who you will serve. The false self and timidity, or who God created you to be, your true self in reverence and really connecting with God deeply in this. Why does fear do that? What did Jesus learn from it? Fear does that because fear, unlike any other thing, tells us what our deepest values are. And if the answer to that question is anything besides connecting with God, then whatever those anythings are, we're going to put them above God. And we're going to be timid and avoidant of anything that might threaten that. And then we won't even treat that well. We're trying to make it something that stops us from feeling loss, rather than, God, what are you asking me to do in this? And that's kind of a deep nugget of what it meant for Jesus to empty himself and to lose everything rather than be timid and fear loss. Fear tells you what you're paying attention to, and Satan will therefore use the pain of loss of these things that have your attention to control you. That's what Hebrews chapter 2 says. In all of its forms, pain is a face of death. And fear of that pain generates this incredible ability for us to be controlled. And that marketers use it all the time to sell you things you don't need because it makes you feel safe. It's a major tension in our culture and a balance between freedom and feeling safe. Lots of things go on that apply to that and appeal to that basic core scenario in each of us, where we're choosing which way we're going to go with it. And Jesus understood this, and rather than become avoidant or timid, he would feel that fear as he got into Gethsemane, as he got near the cross, And he chose to dial in and listen, say, what are you saying to me right now? He learned obedience, but the idea of obedience is there is to come under the hearing of God's voice. Not let me create all these structures to keep me safe, but God, what are you saying to me right now? And in short, pain and the natural avoidance of that pain or fear that Jesus experienced taught him to listen. It taught him what to pay attention to. Rather than sinking into timidity, he rose into reverence. He took the devil's strongest tool, which is fear of pain, fear of death, this constant fear loop, and he redeemed it. He taught us how to process it. And that's what Paul was challenging Timothy to do. Apparently, Timothy struggled, like we struggle, with getting caught up in that fear loop, that spirit of timidity. And he was challenging Timothy not to let that happen, but to become reverent, to be a person of power and love and self control and clear thinking. And by the end of the book of Hebrews, which is where we're drawing this whole passage, it appears that Timothy learned that lesson because he had been arrested for his faith. He had spent time in prison rather than denying his faith or being avoidant. And church history paints a very kind picture of Timothy's end from the point of view of not giving in to fear. That he became a very courageous follower of Christ. In other words, there's an old Tom Petty song that says, I won't back down. You can stand me up against the gates of hell, but I won't back down. I know what's right. I've got just one life. In a world that keeps on pushing me around, I'll stand my ground. I won't back down. I don't think Tom Petty was a particularly spiritual person. I don't know. But those lyrics are exactly right. We are meant, you are created to be a person that could be stood in front of the gates of hell and all that fear of pain and loss and stand. And that's ultimately where the book of Ephesians is heading. So I have some final questions for you. That's what fear can teach you. We looked at what is fear? How does it become reverence? What did fear teach Jesus? What can fear teach you? It can teach you to be that person that doesn't back down from the gates of hell. And to help you answer that question and learn that lesson, I have two questions for you. What is God teaching you through COVID-19? Dig deep for that and then try to take that lesson and bury it deep within you. I need to try to bury it deep within me so that when this passes, because all pandemics so far in the history of mankind have ultimately passed, will we remember? Or will we just fade back into our old routines and some of the shallowness that is there? Will we remember? What is COVID-19 teaching you? How is it helping you learn to dial in and connect more deeply with God and not back down? Number two, what is one specific area where I need to just admit that when I feel that fear spike in this area, I tend to become timid. I tend to become avoidant. I tend to try to make everyone and everybody else not make me feel that. That's timidity. That's a spirit of timidity. What's an area in my life where I need to make sure I don't give into that, and instead it empowers me, and I become a more loving person, a more self-controlled person. I am learning to take that fear spike and convert it into positive energy. That is a piece and a very powerful piece of reverence that has been a focus of my life for especially the past 3 to 4 years. And I've got to give a shout out to Blower Tactical Systems for everything that they've done in that area to help so many people, certainly help me. But I don't regret exploring that area of my life more deeply than I ever had before now, because then you face something like this, and who's ever prepared for something like this? We've never faced it before. It's a pretty steep learning curve, but we can learn. And we can come out of it not being more fearful, not being more avoidant, but taking that same initial energy of fear, not going into timidity, but going into power, love, sound mind, reverence. Even Jesus, as a human being, had to learn that lesson. It wasn't because he was a sinner. It was a lesson he had to learn for our sake so that he could destroy the one who wields the power of all that fear, the devil. And he stood against the gates of hell. And now we can too. So go, stand, and learn from this time. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to the day we can connect in person again. But in the meantime, I'm glad for the opportunity to connect digitally. Be blessed and learn from the fear of pain and from pain and gain a spirit of power. I really pray that for you, that you would experience that at this time. And I pray that in Jesus' name, have a blessed day. Bye.